Magandang umaga po sa atin dito sa Pilipinas. Good evening, New York. Ako po si Louis John Sanchez, kasapi ng Kalupunan ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas at guro sa Department of Broadcast Communication ng College of Mass Communication, UP Diliman. Ako po ang magiging tagapagpadaloy ng ika-12 edisyon ng Adrian E. Cristobal Lecture Series. Nihahatid sa inyo sa kagandang ng Pamilya Cristobal at ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas. Ang seryeng panayam na ito na ginagawa taon-taon tuwing Pebrero 20, kaarawan ni Adrian E. Cristobal, tagapangulong tagapagtatag ng UMPIL, ay pagdiriwang at pagdakila sa pampublikong intelektual ng Pilipinas at nakapag-anyaya na ng 11 individual upang magbigay ng panayam hinggil sa kultura at mga usaping bayan. Ang edisyong ito ay mapapanood via live stream sa UMPIL Facebook page, sa Facebook page ng Linangan sa Imahen, Retorika at Anyo at Librong Lira sa Philippines Institute of Translation at sa mga opisyal na pahina ni Pambansang Alagad ng Sining para sa Panitikan Virgilio S. Almario. Sa streaming ng UMPIL Facebook page, maaari po kayo mag-iwan ng inyong mga komentaryo at tanong at sisikapin po naming basahin sa bahagi ng Open Forum. Sa loob ng Zoom room na ito, maaari rin po kayong magtanong sa pamamagitan ng chat box o direktang pagtatanong sa bahaging ibibigay sa inyo sa Open Forum. Mangyaring pasabihan po ninyo kami sa pamamagitan ng chat box kung ibig ninyong magsalita para po kayo ay aming kilalanin. Bago po ang lahat, ibig po nating kilalanin ng ilang mahahalagang panauhin. Kapapasok-pasok lamang po sa Zoom room na ito ng ating tagapangulong emeritus ng UMPIL, Pambansang Alagad ng Sining para sa Panitikan, Virgilio S. Almario. Magandang umaga po sa Rio. Siyempre, no, kailangan din nating batiin, no, isa-isa, no, ang mga kasapi ng Pamilya Cristobal na naririto po. Nakita ko na po kaninang pagkapasok ko, no, ang butihing may bahay ni Ginoong Adrian Cristobal, si Binibining Teresita Cristobal. Magandang umaga po, ma'am. Naririto rin po ang anak, no, ni syempre, no, nandito yung ating kasama sa kaluputan si Binibining Selina Cristobal, no, ang kanyang kapatid na si Kagalang-galang Adrian Cristobal Jr. na naglingkod na kalihim ng Department of Trade and Industry, at ang kanyang may bahay si Kagalang-galang Dina Joanna Ocampo, Undersecretary, naglingkod na Undersecretary ng Department of Education. Hindi ko lamang po matiyak kung naririto ang isa pa pong anak ni Ginoong Adrian Cristobal, si Pia, no, na naroroon sa New Zealand. Andito rin ang apo, no, ni Ginoong Cristobal, si Arin, at may mga iba pa ako, si Adric yata naririto rin, no. So yung mga kasapi po ng Cristobal family, no, marami pong salamat sa inyong pagtaguyod sa unang programang ito kasama ng UMPIL. Upang buksan ang ating programa, pakinggan panoorin natin ang pangalawang tagapangulo ng UMPIL, ang manunulat at kwentista sa Ingles na premyado ng Gawad Pambansang Alagad ni Balagtas 2015, si Binibining Susan Severino Lara.
Maraming salamat, Division, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to our distinguished guests. I am Susan Lara, Vice Chair of UMPIL, welcoming you to this year's Adrian Cristobal Lecture, an annual lecture series established by the Cristobal family in 2011 in collaboration with the Union ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas. We hold this lecture series to honor the memory and intellectual legacy of the late Adrian Cristobal, renowned author, founding board member, and former chair of UMPIL, whose birthday last February 20, we continue to celebrate today. Since the inaugural Adrian Cristobal lecture, there have been 11 renowned Filipino intellectuals who have given thought-provoking lectures on current social, political, and cultural developments. We are honored to have this year the prize-winning investigative journalist Sheila Coronel as guest speaker on the intriguing subject, Marcos and Memory, the Past in Our Future. So without further ado, let's get on with the rest of the program. Thank you, and back to you, Louie Chan.
Maraming salamat po, Ma'am Sue. Ngayon na po, ating panoorin at pakinggan naman ang kinatawan ng Pamilya Cristobal, ang periodistang si Selina S. Cristobal, kasapi ng kalupunan ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas upang ipakilala sa atin ang seryeng panayam na ito. Selina?
Good morning, everyone. Okay, so I'm here to introduce the lecture series. This is my father, Adrian. He would have been 90 years old on February 20, which was last week. He died on December 22, 2007 at 75 years of age. A good run, he whispered to me. But for us, his family, we lamented that it was too early. If visitations are real, he would have haunted us for naming a memorial lecture after him. He wasn't vain that way. However, that we would hold an annual lecture featuring outstanding public intellectuals, extolling the goodness, the greatness in man, or the possibilities of the goodness and greatness in men in various fields, would have pleased him immensely, and that he hasn't visited us is proof enough. Many of you here are first-timers to the lecture series. I am delighted to give you a brief summary of what has transpired the past 11 years. With the support of UMPIL, the late Ambassador Cabangon Chua, Adrian's personal friend, and the beloved writer, the late Mario Miklat, the first AEC lecture was held in 2010 at the newly built GT Toyota Asian Center Auditorium at UP Diliman. The lecture, A Poetics of Writing, was riveting as delivered by poet and Professor Hemino Abad, who had just received the Premio Ferronia, Italy's most coveted literary prize in the foreign author category. National artist Virgilio Amario, spurred by the controversial artwork in 2011, talked of what is vulgar in sex, art, and religiosity. He was followed by, Resil Mojares in 2013 and Rinaldo Ileto in 2014. Two eminent scholars whose ideas on nationhood and the people behind them are groundbreaking. A year before that, it was Salute Monsod warned us of the pitfalls of political dynasties and how to vote wisely. While in 2016, Marites Vitug looked at the context of the elections and tried to make us see beyond the elite democracy. In the grim aftermath of 2016 elections, poet and columnist Krip Hewson gave a scintillating lecture on the genre of the day, fake news fiction and Facebook likes. Except for Ms. Monsod, all these lectures were published in the first compilation of the AEC lectures. So commercial break, you may order the book through the UMPIL FB page or PM my messenger. Our next lecturers lifted the black cloud with masterful literary criticism and impassioned advocacies. In 2018, we had Professor Soledad Reyes, who talked of the Filipino novel's active engagement in key moments in our history. She was followed in 2019 by novelist and professor of English Jing Hidalgo, Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo in Facebook, who surprised us with the growth of literature in the hands of millennials. In 2020, we invited Justice Antonio Carpio to reiterate his advocacy for our rights in the West Philippine Sea. The only good thing that came out of this pandemic was the possibility of inviting speakers in other countries to give their lectures online. The first of this welcome collateral byproduct was last year's lecture of novelist Miss Ninoch Carrosca, who resides in New York. This year, I am so happy to have finally, as our guest speaker, Miss Sheila Coronel, who could not accept my invitation the previous years because of her academic obligations. So, sit back and relax and enjoy the lecture. Has never been truer than now. But before I go, I would like to introduce a few members of the Cristobal family who are with us now. My beautiful mother, Teresita Cristobal, who turned 90 last September. Where's my mother? My mother, they don't have to turn on the... My brother, there's my mother. My brother, Adrian Jr., who has a nickname of Che Asin Guevara, a lawyer, and is enjoying now private life after 18 years of government service, right? My daughter, Ayadmi, fondly called Erin, a professional improviser and a teacher of improvisation at the School of Third World Theater. Dina Ocampo, wife to my brother Che, there's Dina, and mother to two wonderful sons. Alon, who is a future Olympic swimmer, he's not with us. And Adric, a classical guitarist who just finished his master's at the Maastricht University. We all thank you for being here.
Alright. Maraming salamat po, Selina, at sa iyong pamilya, no? Maraming salamat sa inyong walang pagod na pagtataguyod ng seryeng panayam na ito. Kahapon, pinagdiwang ng buong bayan ang ika-36 na anibersaryo ng People Power Revolution. Kinilala ang revolusyon na banggit na naganap sa Epifanio de los Santos Avenue, EDSA at iba't ibang panig ng Pilipinas bilang isang mapayapang paraang pagbabago. Sinasabing naging inspirasyon pa ito ng mga pagkilos para sa pagbabagong pampamahalaan sa iba't ibang panig ng daigdig. Mahabang panahon na ang nakalipas at parang lagi nang pinagtatalunan. Kung biyaya nga ba o sumpa ang tanging sandali ng pagtindig ng mamamayan laban sa diktadurang Marcos. Ano ang naghihintay sa atin? Lalo't sa darating na halalan higit na napakabigat ng mga nakataya. Yan po ang sisikaping talakayin ng ating tagapanayam ngayong umaga na ipakikilala ng direktor ng Ateneo de Manila University Press, dating tagapangulo at kasalukuyang kasapi ng kalupunan ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas, si Binibining Karina Bolasco. Karina.
Salamat, LJ. Magandang umaga sa lahat. At a critical moment in the life of our nation, we are privileged to have as lecturer someone who was always described as small but terrible, who was a young, passionate journalist, saw up close the rise and fall of a tyrant and laid bare his abuses, insidious and imperceptible. She began reporting on politics and society for the Philippine Panorama magazine, legendary then in the Marcos years as run by women with balls. Her first coverage was the Aquino assassination in 1983. As Marcos began to lose power and press restrictions eased, she wrote of human rights abuses, the growing democratic movement, and the election of Corazon Aquino as president. She moved to Manila Chronicle by 1986, and from 1987 to 1995, as the Manila correspondent for the New York Times and The Guardian, she filed reports on Philippine politics and current affairs. A remarkable journalist who managed to be always at the right place at the right time, she could read a crowd and make sense of a situation. I think it is not just her IQ that's taller or higher than her, but more her EQ. Her cognitive empathy, which is supposed to be a core journalism requirement, has and still does allowed her to listen well to people and follow what is not said or spoken. In 1989, she co-founded the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, which under her leadership became the foremost investigative reporting institution in the Philippines and Asia. In 2001, their work at the center led to the fall of President Joseph Estrada. 2 years later, she won the Ramon Magsaysay Award, Asia's premier prize, which she proudly shared with PCIJ. Joanne Maglipon, who is here, a longtime friend and co-member of Women in Media, attributes her successful journalism to her talent to tell throbbing stories out of data and information, bringing in wit and grit. She has written and edited more than a dozen books on media corruption, political dynasties, freedom of information, and investigative journalism, 8 of which won National Book Awards from the Manila Critics Circle. A Hall of Famer in the Jaime V. Ongpin Awards for having won 4 first prizes in a span of 12 years. She has trained journalists around the world using investigative reporting textbooks she herself wrote for Southeast Asia and the Balkan region. She speaks frequently at international investigative reporting conferences and writes about global investigative journalism. In 2006, the scope and clout of her works expanded. She was named director of the Columbia Stabile Center for Investigative Journalism and joined the faculty of the Journalism School. In 2011, she received one of Columbia University's highest honors, the Presidential Teaching Award. From 2014 to 2020, she was appointed Dean of Academic Affairs of Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. There, at a pivotal moment in journalism, she's able to contribute to building strong institutions that support free and independent reporting in what is now considered worldwide a turbulent media landscape where the absurd, the horrible, and the untrue easily become commonplace. She chairs the Media Development Investment Fund Board and sits on the boards of the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Columbia Journalism Review, ProPublica, and the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism. She also used to head the board of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Fanny Garcia, another co-women in media friend and prize-winning fictionist of the Sigua literary movement, remembers her in her very first job as a co-teacher at the prestigious Philippine Science High School. She was popular among students as she looked like one of them, but respected for her expansive, profound, critical, and progressive teaching style. Gemma Nimenso, also here with us, editor of the US Filipino-American magazine Positively Filipino, recalls that in the earliest days of Women in Media, she was the youngest and smallest among the core group, but she was a giant in talent, smarts, and doggedness that they all looked up to her. Her life's luminous milestones carved out a well-lighted path for journalists here and in other countries to follow, for their words to be dynamic, forceful, and inspiring. For as we now know, democracies today are fragile. They rise and fall with their journalism. Friends, a warm Zoom welcome to Sheila Coronel.
Thank you, Karina, for that really generous introduction. And thank you everyone for being here, especially to my friends in the Women in Media. I feel like I've really grown up and with all of you. And tonight it's February 25 here in New York, and tonight is a special night for many reasons, not least because today was the invasion of Ukraine. So I just want us to take a few minutes to remember and join us and be one with, our friends in Ukraine who also some years ago staged their own people power revolution. So tonight brings back many memories for me. I have a memory of this evening 35 years ago when I was standing outside the massive iron gates of Malacanang Palace. It was day 4 of the popular uprising against the MARCOS regime. I was then a reporter for the Manila Times, a newspaper just reopened after having been shut down when MARCOS declared martial law. Thousands of others were at the palace gates too. We had all heard that the dictator had fled the country, and we wanted to see for ourselves whether that was true. I remember being swept in a giant wave of people that crashed through the gates of the now abandoned palace. Everywhere were signs of a hurried retreat, documents tossed out of a window, empty jewelry cases, bullets scattered on the floor. On the evening of February 25, 1986, I thought, like so many others, this is the end. The MARCOSes had been expunged from our lives forever. How wrong we were. Today, I will talk about memory, about fathers, sons, and daughters, about the MARCOS family and mine, and how, from one generation to the next, the word is passed. I was a martial law baby. My generation grew up watching the unending spectacle of Ferdinand and Imelda. Remember, this was the 20th century, long before YouTube and Netflix. I would have preferred to watch zombie apocalypse, but that wasn't an option. There were only 5 TV channels and 3 newspapers, all owned by MARCOS cronies. We didn't call it fake news then, but it was vintage 1970s propaganda, obvious and crude. I was in 1st grade when MARCOS was first elected president. I studied across the street from Malacanang in a school for girls run by the Sisters of the Holy Ghost. I remember that in the 1960s, the streets around the presidential mansion were busy, filled with traffic and commerce. On Thursdays, hundreds flocked to the church nearby to pray to St. Jude, patron of hopeless causes. I was barely in my teens when martial law was declared. Suddenly, the streets were silenced. The palace gates were shuttered. Barbed wire barricades kept people away. The neighborhood, the entire country was hushed. MARCOS was still president when I finished high school. He continued to issue decrees from his barricaded palace while I went off to college, graduated, and got my first job. My generation had reached adulthood with no memory of any other president. Most of us didn't know that while we were growing up, thousands of dissenters had been tortured, killed, or jailed, that in faraway villages, the army had been let loose to pillage, rape, and murder, that the MARCOSes were stealing our money and squirreling it in Swiss banks and Manhattan real estate. We didn't read any of that in the news. Instead, we were entertained. Muhammad Ali beat Joe Frazier in the Thriller in Manila. We had beauty pageants, the Bolshoi Ballet, Van Cliburn, international film festivals. We watched the MARCOSes party with Brooke Shields and Christina Ford. George Hamilton twirled Imelda to the tune of I Love the Nightlife, while Gina Lollobrigida photographed Ferdinand. Amy was being matched with Prince Charles. The Marcoses behaved like royalty, so we were not surprised when, yet at another Marcos inaugural, the choir sang, "And he shall reign forever and ever," as the orchestra played Handel's Hallelujah chorus. Marcos was the Messiah. How did we think we could get rid of him so easily? The truth is that the Marcos myth-making began long before I was born. Not in my generation, nor even my parents' generation. It began with my grandparents' generation. Today, we blame social media disinformation and the textbooks that glorify or normalize Marcos and martial law. But the lies, evasions, elisions, exaggerations were sowed almost 100 years ago. If they are difficult to weed out now, it is because they are so deeply rooted. My grandfather, Juan B. Coronel, was born in 1909. He was a school teacher in Santa Cruz, Ilocos Sur. So was my grandmother, Victorina Pimentel. Marcos's parents, Mariano and Josefa, were more than 10 years older than my lolo and lola, and they too were school teachers. They were all among the first generation of Filipinos to be educated in English in the public school system set up by the American colonial regime. Mariano Marcos eventually left teaching and took up law and went into politics. In 1935, along with his friend and ally Gregorio Aglipay, he ran in the first ever election of the Philippine Commonwealth. Aglipay ran for president against Manuel Quezon Marcos as representative of Ilocos Norte in the National Assembly. Both of them lost, Mariano Marcos to his longtime rival, Julio Nalundasan. Not long after the results were announced, Nalundasan's triumphant followers paraded around town in cars and trucks. One of them carried coffins with Aglipay's and Marcos's names on them. The revelers lingered in front of the Marcos home in Batac and shouted, "Marcos is dead." For the Marcoses, this was, in the words of the Supreme Court, both provocative and humiliating. We all know what happened next. The following night, Nalundasan was shot and killed. The principal suspect, Ferdinand Marcos, champion shooter of the ROTC rifle and pistol team. He had then just turned 18. A court in Lawag tried and found him guilty, but he made an impassioned plea to be allowed to continue his law studies while in jail. Ferdinand was badass. Here was the valedictorian of his class, acting as his own lawyer and appealing the ruling while studying the bar. He topped the 1939 bar exams, wrote an 830-page brief to the Supreme Court, and argued his case in an all-white sharkskin suit. He was acquitted and saved from the death penalty. By 1940, the wide publicity given the case had made him a legend. If you were Ilocano, like my grandparents, from a part of the country that was hard-scrabble poor, its people living on land wedged between mountain and sea, famous for their frugality and work ethic, and who valued family and honor, you would be cheering for him too. Up to now, we don't know who killed Nalundasan. We do know that Jose P. Laurel, the Supreme Court justice who wrote the decision, was Marcos's law professor at UP. It was he who convinced the High Court to reverse the conviction by arguing not that Marcos was innocent, but the country needed brilliant people like him. The justice's son, Jose III, was Marcos's classmate since high school and his Upsilon Sigma Phi fraternity mate. It was he who drove Ferdinand to Malacanang, so President Quezon, no less, could congratulate him on his acquittal. Jose Jr., Justice Laurel's son, would tell me all of this when I interviewed him many years later. Like so many other politicians of that era, he liked to tell the Marcos Nalundasan story. It was legend. This was 1984. Confetti was raining down on Ayala Avenue in the protests that followed the assassination of Senator Benigno Aquino. I was a neophyte reporter, and the old man was giving me a lesson on the longevity of political families. What I took from it was something else: their easy embrace of chicanery and political murder. It was a lesson Ferdinand Marcos had learned at age 18. Marcos did not trust historians. History, he wrote in his diary in 1971, should not be left to historians. Make history and then write it. That's what he said, and that's what he did. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Marcos was called, like so many young Filipinos, to defend Bataan. When Bataan fell, he joined the Death March and ended up a prisoner of the Japanese in Capas, Tarlac. My grandfather also fought in Bataan and was also in the Death March, but was so sick of malaria, he was left behind in the town of Hermosa. When he recovered, he joined the anti-Japanese resistance, was captured and executed by the Japanese in his hometown in September 1944. He was only 35 years old. For many years, my Lola kept the documents that attested to her husband's service. This one said, my Lolo, a graduate of the ROTC like Marcos, was sent with his unit to defend the coast of Bataan and surrendered to the Japanese at the foot of Mount Samat. It said he was spying from the guerrillas when he was captured. My father, the eldest son, then not quite 11, was the last in his family to see my Lolo alive. That's the document. The next slide, yeah. He told us he went to the plaza just before his father was hanged. And there, my Lolo entrusted him with the care of my Lola and his two younger siblings. Unlike Marcos, my Lolo did not get any medals, nor were movies made about his war exploits. He also didn't have the protection of family and friends in the right places. Marcos did. According to US Army intelligence reports in a diary kept by a Japanese war interpreter, Mariano Marcos had welcomed the Japanese to Laoag and had spoken at a pro-Japanese rally in his hometown. It could be that the older Marcos, like many other nationalists, sympathized with the Japanese because they were at war against US colonialists. Whatever the case, some Marcos biographers speculate that Mariano's Japanese connections facilitated his son's release from prison in August 1941. So what did Marcos really do during World War II? Like so many things about the Marcos family, the facts are hard to pin down. Marcos said he cheated death many times during the Battle of Bataan, and afterwards, when he led a guerrilla unit, ang mga Maharlika, that fought heroically against the Japanese. In 1964, the American journalist Hartzell Spence published a glowing Marcos biography, For Every Tear a Victory, that detailed the young Ferdinand's cunning and battle heroics. By the time he was campaigning for president in 1965, Marcos had 28 war medals, making him the most decorated Filipino war hero. But when historian Alfred McCoy trawled US military archives in the 1980s, this is what he found. Marcos, unlike other decorated officers, got most of his medals by lobbying for them when he was already in public office, long after the war was over. In 1963, according to McCoy, then President Diosdado Macapagal, eager to get Congressman Marcos's support, awarded him 10 medals in a single day. The records also showed that between 1946 and 1948, US Army investigators had dismissed Marcos's claims. Maharlika, they said, never existed. Its exploits were exaggerated, fraudulent, and absurd. In 1950, the US Veterans Administration found that so-called Maharlika members were guilty of atrocities against civilians and were selling contraband to the Japanese. Marcos himself, according to this document from the US National Archives, was arrested by the US Army for soliciting funds under false pretenses, but was released at the intercession of General Manuel Rojas. Maharlika and the World War II medals are at the heart of the Marcos big lie, the foundation of the myth that helped elect him to Congress and later made him president. My father, Antonio Coronel, who was 32 at that time, was among the millions who voted for Marcos in 1965. He was Ilocano after all, and the lawyer orphaned by the war. I could understand why Marcos, the dashing hero emerging unscathed and rising like a phoenix from the ashes of the Pacific War, would be so alluring for him and so many others. My father was a provinciano who came to Manila to study. Higher education boomed in the post-war years. War reparations and aid revived the economy and provided jobs and education for a rising urban professional class. In 1955, when my father graduated from law school, Marcos was in his second term in Congress. As the representative of Ilocos Norte, he was eloquent and feisty. The landed gentry who dominated the legislature considered him a promising upstart. He impressed those like my father who had no inherited wealth and saw their education and professional skills as their entree to society. In Marcos, they saw a reflection of their own ambitions. When he said he was destined to be president, they cheered him on. When he ran for public office after the war, Marcos used his embellished war record to propagate the myth of his invincibility and inevitability. Iginuhit sa tadhana, it is writ in the stars. This was the title of the 1965 movie starring matinee idols Luis Gonzalez and Gloria Romero, released before the election that made Marcos president. We'll return to this inevitability later. Even as he introduced Mad Men type advertising into a Philippine election campaign, Marcos also cultivated the legend that he had an anting-anting, a magic amulet. His commissioned biographer Hartzell Spence amplified this tall tale. He wrote that Marcos had inherited the amulet from Aglipay, the anti-Spanish and anti-American revolutionary who was a family friend and political ally. According to the legend, Aglipay himself made the incision to embed the anting-anting on Marcos's back before the Battle of Bataan. This gave Ferdinand the power to appear and reappear and restore the dead to life. Marcos made Filipinos believe he was of mythic proportions. Through Aglipay, he was connected to the revolutionary and anti-colonial tradition. At the same time, the fictional Maharlika linked Marcos to the noble datus of the pre-colonial age. He was Malakas of the Filipino creation myth. After martial law, he commissioned nationalist historians to write Tadhana, a multi-volume history that portrayed him and his new society as the culmination of our nation's revolutionary and anti-colonial aspirations. Marcos was the end of history. Until now, followers of the Marcos cult worship him in some villages in Ilocandia. They say he is the incarnation of Christ or of Jose Rizal, and they await his return. Even those who didn't like Marcos imagined him to be more than ordinary, a Shakespearean figure. The Hamlet Marcos, agonizing whether to declare martial law or to shoot at the protesters on EDSA in 1986. The Macbeth Marcos, egged on to murder by a power-hungry wife. the Richard III Marcos, who would kill and pillage everything that stood in his way. If Marcos has such a hold on our collective imagination, it is in part because of the lies and half-truths he and his courtiers have told over and over again until they were accepted as fact. It is because they have sown so much confusion over the facts so that even now truth seems elusive. The Marcoses have been at this since 1935. Let me say this again. The rewriting of history did not begin after the fall. This myth-making is one reason why today many believe we are at the cusp of the second coming, the second Marcos coming, the zombie apocalypse. When Marcos declared martial law in 1972, he borrowed from the fascist playbook, point to a threat and hype it so that people believe their safety and security are at stake, and only a strong man stands in the way of perdition. As Marcos said in the martial law declaration, only he can save the republic and form a new society. When he was elected president in 2016, Rodrigo Duterte and Marcos Pan would adopt the same fiery and messianic tone. Both men saw themselves as saviors. They believed the country needed a strong leader and disciplined people. They were willing to jail, torture, and kill to save society from unruly and dangerous elements. Even good citizens must be watched and, if necessary, gagged and muzzled. The slogan of the martial law years was, "Sa ikauunlad ng bayan, disiplina ang kailangan." What drove people to rebellion or drugs wasn't poverty, injustice, or inequality. It was a lack of discipline. I have one example of what that discipline meant. Those of you who are older than 50 will remember, as I do, the days when Imelda Marcos fenced off large parts of the city to hide Manila's squalor. Even before martial law, many of Manila's poorest residents had been protesting Marcos' infrastructure and beautification projects for demolishing their homes and destroying their communities. Trinidad Herrera was one of the most effective and eloquent urban poor organizers. She was known internationally and had even met with both Marcos and the World Bank, the funder of government projects. When the Pope visited Tondo in 1970, she spoke on her community's behalf. In April 1977, just before the Marcoses were slated to host a big UN conference, Herrera went missing. After more than a week of searching, her lawyer, former Senator Soc Rodrigo, found her at a detention cell at the Military Intelligence and Security Group. In a letter he sent to top officials, he described what had been done to her. She was ordered to remove all her clothes until she was completely naked. Then she was made to attach and wind by herself around her left nipple the end of one of two electrode wires. While electric shock was being applied on her nipple, one of the torturers was holding the other electrode in front of her vagina, uttering threats that if she would not cooperate, he would attach the wire to her vagina. I never met Trining Herrera, but I have a vague memory of briefly meeting the two lieutenants, Eduardo Matiliano and Prudencio Regis, who she said tortured her. Their lawyer was my father, Antonio Coronel, who often met his clients over breakfast at the family table. Few torturers then or since have been brought to trial, but the case got wide publicity in the US, where Congress was debating whether to slash military aid to the Philippines because of human rights violations. The military was forced to bring Matiliano and Regis to a court-martial. My father defended them. and they were acquitted. Years later, he would also defend Marcos's chief of staff, Fabian Ver, when he was tried for the assassination of Senator Aquino. And after the fall of Imelda Marcos, who was being sued for the family's legendary ill-gotten wealth. I had frequent arguments with my father about his choice of clients. His answer always was, even the guilty have the right to a proper defense. He was a criminal lawyer, he reminded me. His job was to defend criminals. He was called in after a crime had been committed. Unlike corporate lawyers, he said cheekily, who are consulted before the crime. He was a charming rascal, my father. He could argue his way out of anything. He teased me about my objections to his clients, but not to the shoes and dresses his lawyer's fees bought me. He also told me that Marcos had asked him to rein in his journalist daughter. He supposedly said something like, I can do that if you can restrain me. Being my father's daughter gave me some protection. But did it also give me the courage to do the kind of reporting I did? More courage than I actually had. My father was not a Marcos loyalist. He wasn't blind to the excesses. But like a lot of smart men of his generation, he was drawn to Marcos, like moths to a flame. Adrian Cristobal, after whom this lecture is named, was a renowned literary figure before becoming Marcos's speechwriter. He brought other writers into the Marcos fold. Blas Ople, ex-socialist, ex-journalist, was among the smartest and most self-aware of all the president's men. He told me not long before the fall, when there was fierce infighting in the Malacanang snake pit, he said, Marcos is like a banyan tree that keeps everything under its shade, so nothing grows underneath. And yet, he too couldn't leave the shade. Smart as they were, these men could not resist the allure of power, the money and privileges that came with it, and the giddiness of basking in the sovereign's glow. Marcos knew how to flatter their egos, his ambition, his virility, charm, and wit. His ease with power were irresistible to a lot of men, and women too. The appeal of the strong man, of fearsome and unaccountable power, is nearly universal. The Yale professor, Jason Stanley, whose parents fled Nazi Europe, wrote, fascism is not a new threat, but rather a permanent temptation. To fight it, he said, we must resist normalization. Here I quote from his book, How Fascism Works. What normalization does is to transform the morally extraordinary into the ordinary. It makes us able to tolerate what was once intolerable by making it seem as if this is the way things have always been. This bears repeating. What normalization does is to transform the morally extraordinary into the ordinary. It makes us able to tolerate what was once intolerable by making it seem as if this is the way things have always been. Which brings us to Ferdinand Marcos Jr., whose platform, if he has one, is the normalization of Marcos. Like his father in 1935, he is seeking to redeem the family honor and avenge his family's fall. Like his father, he is erasing and rewriting history. He is also propagating the myth of his electoral invincibility and the inevitability of his presidency. Those seeking to explain why another Marcos may become president say it's because we have failed to hold the family to account. We did not demarcosify the country. We sent the Marcoses to exile and then welcomed them back. The LaSalle political scientist Julio Tejanqui faults the political elite who helped restore the Marcoses and their allies to power through elections. He blames the weak party system that allowed for the authoritarian contamination of our political life. Sociologist Sheila Coronel of the Ateneo says the Marcoses are masters at selling fantasy and the promise of restoring greatness. Others attribute Junior's stickiness simply to money, machine, and social media. They credit his image makers for marketing Junior as the pale, bland, harmless version of his father, acceptable even to the pearl-clutching Cory matrons, just as pinakbet without bagnet is acceptable to vegans. Some put the onus on the opposition for being disunited, underfunded, and weak. Others despair about Marcos' nostalgia and magical thinking, the promise of a shower of Yamashita or Taliano gold at the end of the election. Many, especially among the educated, say it's because uneducated voters cannot see through the fog of disinformation. The hyper-educated point to world historical forces, the erosion of democracy globally, the distrust of liberal elites, and the growing inequality that drives citizens to the autocrats' embrace. All these explanations have the ring of truth, but they also have something in common. They paint an unflattering picture of us and our fellow citizens. It's as if we are all passive receptacles of Marcos propaganda and social media manipulation. We've either been conned or seduced by the Marcoses, or we are pawns of a history not of our own making. By telling you my family story, I may have succumbed to this too. Guilty of the narrative that exonerates the Marcoses by saying, all of us are at fault, we were all complicit, or blameless because history is to blame. The fault is in our stars. But resisting normalization means resisting disempowering narratives. It means not being content with the consolation offered by explanation. While agonizing over this lecture, I had a dream that I was desperately trying to write on a piece of ruled paper, but there was no ink coming out of my pen. I was frantic. The harder I tried, the more I failed. Either the pen wouldn't write or the paper would be too damp to write on. You can interpret this dream however you want. To me, it was a nightmare of disempowerment. The sense that wherever I go, I cannot escape history. I cannot flee from Marcos. Even here in New York, I walk down Fifth Avenue past Tiffany's, and I think not of Audrey Hepburn having breakfast there, but of Imelda Marcos shutting it down so she could shop undisturbed for her jewelry with our money. Farther south, just beside St. Patrick's Cathedral, is Olympia Towers, where Imelda had a 7-bedroom condominium on the 43rd floor. Severina Rivera, a Phil-Am lawyer assigned to hunt for Marcos assets, told me she found paintings of old masters hidden under the beds there. One of them, by the French artist Fontaine Latour, was auctioned in 1987 for $400,000. At night, if you are in a tall building with a view, Manhattan glitters like a box of jewels, irresistible to Imelda. In the 1980s, she bought 4 buildings here, including this jewel near Central Park, with its copper pinnacle that lights up at night. Some years ago, I sat in a Manhattan courtroom to watch the trial of Vilma Bautista, Imelda's personal secretary. In the 1980s, Bautista kept meticulous records of Imelda's shopping and the millions of dollars withdrawn from the Philippine National Bank in New York to fund her sprees. By the time I saw her, Bautista was a frail, broken woman who shuffled to the courtroom, always dressed in black. The court said she had taken 4 impressionist paintings from Imelda's townhouse, sold Monet's water lily pond for $32 million, and lied about it on her taxes. In 2017, when she was 78, she started a 6-year jail sentence. That same year, Imelda turned 88. 2 years later, she would celebrate her 90th birthday at a roaring party with 2,500 people at a sports stadium. And yes, hundreds got food poisoning. All this fuels my fevered nightmares. Marcos is a hungry ghost. He torments our dreams, lays claim to our memories, and feeds on our hopes. It's going to be okay, I hear the ghost saying. The second coming will not be a murderous tyrant, just a cotton candy confection spun by PR consultants and TikTok influencers. My son is not Macbeth, he's only Pinoy Big Brother. You will be in La La Land, a country without memory, without justice, without accountability. Only the endless loop of one family, the soundtrack provided by Imelda. It is time to hush this ghost. A Marcos return is inevitable only if we believe it to be. If we surrender our power and agency, if we accept explanation instead of action. I have nothing against Ferdinand Jr. He is only a year older than me. I don't resent the fact that when he was 22, he was made governor of Ilocos Norte while I was freelancing and trying to get a job in a newspaper. My father did write a letter introducing me to one of his editor friends. The editor didn't seem impressed either by him or by me. I never got a response. I am sleepless because of what the Marcoses represent. World-class plunder, torture, and murder, with no acknowledgement, no apology, no repentance, no attempt at restitution, not even taxes paid on inherited stolen wealth. And yet here they are, performing civility and restraint, telling us to chill. On this night, 35 years ago, I stood outside the massive iron gates of Malacanang Palace. In the months and weeks before that night, the most erudite observers were telling us there was no way Marcos would go away. But in 1986, we proved them wrong. Filipinos asserted their agency against the weight of power and the forces of history. So today, wherever we are, we must remember this. We took down a dictator. Sure, we botched it afterwards, but that doesn't change the fact that we ousted a tyrant. 1986 was an end, even if not the end. It was a time of astonishment and possibility. We had a sense that history was being made, and we had a hand in its making. Make history, Marcos wrote in his diary in 1971, and then write it. We made history, and we can do so again. And this time, we should make sure we write it. We should make sure we write it. Can you show the last slide, please, Selena? The next one. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Thank you for sharing this evening or this morning with me.
Maraming salamat. Maraming salamat, Sheila. No, una syempre, no, parang behind the scenes, pinag-uusapan namin kung gaano katalim at gaano kaganda ang iyong panayam, no? siguro katulad ng ginagawa ko, no, tuwing merong Adrian Cristobal lecture, no, nagbibigay ako ng konting synthesis, no, para do sa mga kapapasok lamang, no. So ang panayam na ito ay tungkol sa mga gunita, no, at memory, no, mga gunitang binalikan para sa ating ngayong umaga ni Binibining Sheila Coronel. May kinalaman ito sa tinawag niyang unending spectacle, no, ng mag-asawang Marcos na pinalayaw at pinalawig ng tinawag niya ring vintage propaganda sa matagal na panahon, no. Isa sa mga tumimo, no, sa akin mismo habang ako ay nakikinig ay yung hindi tayo binigyan ng pagkakataon na, no, na maging informed, no, o maging maalam, bagkus, and this is, I'm quoting from the lecture, instead we were entertained, no. I clearly remember the reportage, no, that you edited one time, no, about the 1990s mass media landscape, no, via PCIJ, no. This is something that reverberates, no, that describes also that time, no. Ang lektura rin po, mga kaibigan, ay sinabi ko na nga, pagbabalik sa kasaysayan. So umabot tayo doon sa alamat, no, maalamat na sagupaan ng mga Marcos at nalundasan, no. At ang pinaka-espesyal, mga kaibigan, sa mga binigay sa atin ngayong umaga ay yung personal na revelasyon, no, na binahagi sa atin, no, ni Binibining Coronel, no, hinggil sa kumbaga sa tagpuan, no, sa pagkukrus ng landas ng kanyang personal na istorya at ng kasaysayan ng bayan, no. Maraming mga iba pang mga kislap diwa o insight na lumabas dito, lalo pat napaka-total, no, noong ideya na sinasabi na Marcos is the end of history. Bagaman sa bandang huli, no, gusto ko rin yung binanggit kanina na Marcos as a hungry ghost, no. Maraming mga talinghaga, no, na ginamit dito, no. Gusto ko lang tanungin muna, Sheila, di ba, parang gaano kahirap isulat itong mga bagay na ito para sa iyo? Parang kanina nagbanggit ka ng isang panaginip, no, na pinipilit mong sulatin, napaka-poignant noong imahen na walang lumalabas na tinta, no. Parang nung inihanda mo itong panayam na ito, ano yung pag-agonize, no, na pinagdaanan mo, no, sa pagninilay, no, dito sa kasaysayan natin at sa iyong personal na kasaysayan?
Mahirap para sa akin na isulat ito kasi parang marami akong multo na kinakausap. I was speaking to many ghosts. The ghost of Marcos, the ghost of my father, the ghost of my grandfather. So, parang ang pagkatapos ko itong sinulat, talagang parang may kinuhang tumor sa dibdib ko. Parang ang laking ginhawa. Pero pagsulat nito, mahirap talaga kasi marami akong multo na kinakausap. I was speaking. Yeah. So parang para sa akin parang exorcism din ito of the many ghosts of my past. It was hard. Pero ang tingin ko kailangan talaga makita ang kasaysayan, ang buong kasaysayan ng mga Marcoses na matagal na ito at ang kasaysayan natin, maraming pamilyang Pilipino ay parang intertwined sa kasaysayan din ng mga Marcoses. Yeah. So gusto kong pakita din kung bakit many things. I wanted to show both how history imprisons us, but also how we can change history. And how, as Marcos said, make history and then write it. And I thought it was also important. That dream actually broke it for me that, okay, it's writing and not being able to write. And that balance of what history gives you and how you can change history is what I wanted to present here. Malinaw ba yun?
Yeah, no,
Oo.
alam mo kasing,
Oo.
din, no, parang, kasi ito, mga elaborations na yung ginagawa natin, no, doon sa pag-uusap, dahil, totoo naman, napakalinaw nung naratibo at pagkikwento, at napakatotoo. Personally, ano ang nararamdaman mo ngayon na ito talaga, no, parang ang panahon ng election ay isang liminal period para sa atin. Maraming mga datos, no, lumilitaw, no, na nagpapakita ng panguna nung anak, no, ng diktador. Personally, anong nararamdaman mo, no, na mayroong ganitong ang posibilidad, no, ng pagbabalik, no, ng mga Marcos sa sa kapangyarihan, at ang pinakamalala pa sa tingin ko ay yung pagsasanib puwersa, no, noong mga iba pang mga partido, no, na mayroong ganoong kaparehong mga kwento ng katiwalian, no, ng pang-aapi sa bayan, sa mga taong bayan. Anong personal na nararamdaman mo to?
Parang sa akin parang recurring nightmare kasi nag-umpisa ako bilang periodista noong 1982, panahon pa ni Marcos. Tapos ngayon, 1982, how many years is that? That's 40 years later. Marcos pa rin. Parang umiikot lang ba ang kasaysayan? Para bang wala ng pagbabago? Kaya para bang lahat ng ginawa natin, lahat ng paghihirap natin, parang balik ulit tayo doon sa panahon ng kadiliman. Parang lahat ng mga puwersa ng kadiliman nagsama-sama sa this particular historical moment. So, kaya talaga para sa akin parang masamang panaginip. Diba?
Alala ko lang kasi syempre, no, parang nung nagsisimula kang periodista nung dekada 80, no, maaga ng dekada 80. Kung 1982 ka nagsimula, no, so 2 years old pa lang ako noon. Ngayon meron kasi tayong tinatawag na no, parang post-truth, which is also beautifully written about by Michiko Kakutani, no. Ano sa palagay mo yung kaibahan, no, nung panahon na yon when we deal with the truth, no, yung truth in the journalistic sense, no, saka yung tinatawag ngayon na post-truth, no?
Nung 1982, ang problema doon, 3 lang ang dyaryo, 5 lang ang TV stations, at saka halos lahat ng mababasa mo galing sa Malacanang. Diba? So ang problema noon, kakaunti lang yung information. Information was controlled, so it was information scarcity. Ngayon, it's information abundance, the complete opposite. Marami masyado tayong truths, half-truths, nagsama-sama. So it's impossible not to tell what the truth is because so many untruths. Our information space is so toxic and filled with untruths. So kaya sinasabi nilang post-truth because now people are entitled to their own truths, not just entitled to their own truths, they can publish their own truths. It's so the difference really is in the magnitude of the information that people are given and must process. Kailan lang, meron ako mga nakasamang mga batang mga manunulat at tinanong ko sa kanila, ano bang mas gusto niyo nung panahon namin nakakaunti lang yung dyaryo at yung panahon ngayon na TikTok, Facebook, social media, parang mas mahirap yata ngayon. Parang sa tingin ko mas mahirap kasi pero noon, syempre sabi ko, makukulong. Pag-uusap namin, noon makukulong ka, mapapatay ka. Ngayon, matutol ka sa social media. Pero parang ito lang ba yung choices natin? Di ba? Parang these are the choices we're being given and making it look like ito lang, hanggang dito lang talaga. Pero that's why I'm stressing the power of agency, that we can do something. Because there are big historical forces, big social media, technological forces that engender helplessness with us. And that's why I'm saying we can write this. Kaya yun yung panaginip ko, hindi ako makasulat. Ang tingin ko, marami ring kapwa Pilipino, kapwa periodista na ganun din ang feeling na parang, anong pwedeng gawin? Because they've already succeeded in convincing us they're inevitable. They are our destiny.
Ano ang pinaka-challenge sa tingin? Kasi syempre no, ikaw ay isa sa mga tagapanguna or drivers ng investigative journalism sa Pilipinas at sa region, no? At ngayon nga ay nariyan kang sa Estados Unidos para magturo ng periodismo, no? Ano yung challenges na nakikita mo pa sa mga darating na panahon sa investigative journalism?
Maraming challenges. Sa maraming bansa sa buong mundo ngayon, may mga populist leaders, autocrats, mga mala MARCOS, mga mala Duterte na hindi naniniwala sa malayang pamamahayag. Kaya grabe ang harassment, at iba pang pressures doon sa journalists. Tapos, ngayon nga ang sinabi ko, because we have such a toxic information space, it's very hard to find an audience for fact-based journalism and accountability journalism, because the audience has so much to choose from. And journalists themselves are under attack. And for being part of the liberal elites, for being fake news, etc., etc. So the same challenges that face ordinary people because of a toxic information landscape face journalists, but even more so because we are in the information business.
At kailangan patuloy pa rin no ang periodismo at pagmamatsyag sapagkat yun pa rin ang trabaho talaga ng mga journalist, no, ng mga periodista. Ngayon po mga kaibigan, tatanggap naman tayo ng tanong mula sa ating gallery dito sa Zoom, no? So kung maaari lamang po ay magpakilala po kayo kung ibig niyo pong magtanong. Pwede po kayong magbukas ng inyong camera at magpakilala, no? Pero may mga ipinapadala na sa akin ditong mga tanong, no, mula sa ating chat box. To gusto ko lang basahin yung yung ilan, no, kasi yung iba mga komentaryo, no. Galing kay Dominic Danao. I feel Milan Kundera in the discussion about the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. Kundera's Unbearable Lightness of Being was one of the books I snitched from Sheila by his younger brother, the first among many she would eventually share, no. Actually, toto ako kanina kasi syempre, literatura, no. Grabe, no, yung kaalaman din sa Shakespeare, no ba? Pero syempre no, dakilang mga mga dakilang mga tyrants yung mga hindi naman what I mean to say is, the well-remembered tyrants in Shakespeare always ring a bell, no, when we talk about tyranny and despotism, naalala natin 'yan. Ito, no, isang tanong mula kay Jojo Fresnedi. Thank you, Ms. Coronel. Where do we begin to bust the myth of the Marcoses, and how do we sustain the effort until the truth reaches the majority?
Naku, that's a really difficult question, but I think all of us are the bearers of memory and the bearers of truth. And we are all, I see some priests in this room, we are all evangelists. We speak the truth wherever we can. We spread the word wherever we can. Because if we say there's nothing we can do, then nothing is ever going to change. Mm-hmm. So we must bear witness, we must tell the truth. If nothing happens in this generation, but maybe just for history, so that there's a historical record of what this era was like. So witnessing, truth-telling, those are our tasks for this moment.
All right. No, may pahabol siyang tanong dito. One popular notion of the MARCOS durability is the ease with which the Filipino voter is bought, nabibili, no? Talaga bang it's all about the money? No? Yun yung tanong niya.
You know, in 1986, there was so much money, not just money, but all the guns, and gold. And yet, Marcos didn't win that election. And yet, I remember, and this is what gives me hope. I remember being out on election night, February 6, 1986, and going to the municipios where the ballots were being canvassed and counted, and people chaining themselves to ballot boxes, using torches when they brought the ballot boxes in at the middle of the night from the municipal hall to the provincial hall so that they would be canvassed. People literally guarding the ballot boxes with their lives despite goons. Many years later, I would be in Cavite, and there was this farmer who was telling me in Silang, Cavite, how the Marcos goons stole the ballot boxes, and all of the farmers took it back from them, and it was like a basketball game. They were chasing the ballot boxes all around because there was a lot of money poured into that election, but people believed that they had a right to vote whomever they wanted. So money is not everything. Money is important, but it's not everything.
Ang ganda nun, no? Kasi syempre, no, isang pinanggagalingan ng ating distress at ng ating kawalan ng pag-asa ay yung laki, talagang sobrang laking makinarya. No? Parang hindi nga sila nakapwesto pero meron silang makinarya, yung kapangyarihan ay nasa kanilang poder. Alright? So, ang ganda nung insight na yon, no? Parang hindi lahat ito tungkol sa pera, no? At wag tayong mangamba dahil hindi naman lahat ito tungkol sa pera. All right? Gusto kong tanungin itong isa ditong padala sa atin, no? Mula kay Omar Rahman. How did other countries like the United States help to keep the Marcoses in power?
Well, the Americans were key props. They bolstered Marcos's power. There were huge amounts of military and development aid given to the Marcos regime, even if they knew that Marcos was using part of the, siphoning part of the money to Swiss bank accounts. The Americans supported Marcos because he was against the communists. And one reason why Marcos stayed so long was partly because of American support.
Mm-mm.
The infrastructure for repression was, large part of it was funded by the Americans.
May kinalaman din talaga yun. Parang kung babalikan natin ang ating kontemporanyong kasaysayan, no, mahalaga ring balikan yung konteksto ng Cold War.
Yes.
No? Dahil yung pagbabalanse ng mga kapangyarihan ng mga panahong yon ay nag-necessitate, no, ng pagsuporta sa mga rehimen ng iba't ibang mga bansa, no, para manatili silang kaalyado, no. May tanong dito ang periodista din, ang ating kaibigan na si Ginoong Howie Severino. In a scenario where Marcos Jr. wins, have you imagined how he will govern with all of his legal and political baggage and without any of the brilliance and other advantages of his father?
He will do as he did when he was governor of Ilocos Sur and congressman and later senator. He'll have other people work for him. So it will be mainly, he'll be more like, presiding over vast array of, I hope he'll get smart people if he becomes president. But, and this is why a lot of people think, it's not going to be so bad if Bongbong becomes president, because he's not like his father. He's not going to be a tyrant. He's not going to be a dictator. But that sets a very low bar for us. A very low bar. I mean, if he wants to run for public office, he first has to acknowledge his sins, the sins of his father. He has to pay his taxes like all of us do. He has to make amends. So it's I think this reasoning is all wrong, that just because he's harmless and not as bad as his father and not as industrious or brilliant, that he can probably be okay. I mean, that to me is is, it's like, do we settle for that in what we want to be the president?
Yeah. Actually, meron pa dapat i-follow up doon, no? Kasi malakas din yung kanyang running mate na si Davao City Mayor Inday Sara Duterte, no? So parang nag-iiba rin yung dynamics with the Duterte daughter around, no? So halimbawa parang halimbawa ma-sweep nila yung slate na yon, VP and president, di ba? Parang ano kaya yung ano kaya ang mangyayari, no, with the Duterte still around?
Well, the vice president has very little power, as we know, right? But ako ang tingin ko, this is a stepping stone for a Duterte presidency 6 years from now. Maybe she will be given a cabinet position like other vice presidents had gone in the past. But if you're saying that she's helping him win votes, yeah, that's true. In Mindanao, she's very strong, and the Duterte, although Duterte himself still has not endorsed Bongbong, I think it helps. It's stronger, but it's as if the two strong men in our history were put together. And are we destined to but just be electing the sons and daughters of strong men? Is my question. And Sara, what does Sara Duterte represent? Remember, the Davao Death Squad continued to operate while she was still mayor.
Yes.
Yeah. So she is very much like her father, maybe less strident and more, more articulate and not as fiery in the speech making, but she is very much her father's daughter.
May I?
Yeah. Ito lang muna, anuhin muna natin ito, no? Ilubusin ko lang itong tanong natin dito sa chat box, no? Ito galing kay Pores Sabad, no? Thanks for a great talk and for all of the important work you do. I'm interested in how nations deal with the sins of the past. In hindsight, how did the Philippine educational system deal with the sins of the past, and what role did that play now in Bongbong's rise?
Certainly the failure of our educational system to provide the truth or the facts about martial law has contributed to an entire generation, maybe 2 generations, not knowing what really happened. Education is an important part of this, but I also blame the Marcoses for continuing to spread lies and disinformation. So it's not just because we failed, it's also because they were very active. As I've said, they've been doing this since 1935. They've been very active in creating the myths about the family. So so it's not just the educational system after the fall of Marcos, it's a long process.
Actually, After, parang a few days ago, parang I read an article from Vera Files. Parang the mother was also given medals, I think, no, in honor of her supposed participation in the suffragette. Tapos maganda yung yung artikulo na nabasa ko, no. Ito huling tanong natin mula doon sa chat box mula kay Alex Arumpak. What kind of kasi ito ginamit ito kanina, no? Actually, ito very millennial yung term, the zombie apocalypse. What kind of landscape can you imagine, no, for journalists or filmmakers in case a Marcos zombie apocalypse happens?
So thank you for that question, Alex. Alex is the director of Aswang, so I think she's sympathetic to all of these supernatural figures, zombies and Aswang. So Alex, we've been there before. During martial law, the press was controlled. You find a way. And I think technology, the ways in which information and images can be disseminated freely, even in the most repressed countries. They're doing it in Myanmar. They're doing it in Ukraine now, in the midst of war. I'm confident your generation, Alex, will find a way to report even during the zombie apocalypse, to report and film and create a historical record.
Pagkaaswang ng lipunan, pagkaaswang ng daigdig. May narinig po ako nagsalita. Is it Karina?
Selena.
Selena, go ahead.
Yeah, in both Facebook and YouTube, maraming congratulatory comments and praising you, brilliant. And may isang tanong dito kay Angie Stewart. Isa lang daw tanong niya. She considers you a national treasure. Kailan ka daw makakabalik para magturo sa mga journalist naman dito?
Soon, pagkatapos ng COVID, I plan to be there siguro middle of this year.
Wonderful.
Yeah, regardless of who becomes president, I will be there. And yeah, pag nandiyan naman ako, I always meet journalists and students. So yeah,
Okay.
we'll think about it. Yeah.
Great.
Actually, Sheila, parang naku-curious din ako, no? Parang syempre sa konteksto ng pagtuturo mo dyan sa Colombia, di ba? Parang may kalawakan, no, yung mga kinakausap mong mga mag-aaral, no, iba't iba yung pinanggagalingan nila. Ano yung mga common na karanasan, no, na nakakaharap mo, no, when it comes to, you know, or mga karanasan na very similar sa atin, no, na meron din silang ganitong mga klaseng konteksto?
Alam nyo, kahit dito sa Amerika, grabe din ang sitwasyon para sa yung trolling, hate speech, pag-atake sa mga journalists, pag-surveillance sa mga journalists, death threats, rape threats against journalists. Karaniwan na yan dito. Hindi na yan bago. Lalo na kung ang isang periodista ay hindi puti. No? Maraming mga insulto or babae, especially female journalists, are under attack. So I think universal yung attack against journalists, attack on their legitimacy, on their credibility, and on their ability to on their motives. Yeah. So halos parang regression to the mean ang tawag ko nga dyan. Parang pare-pareho na lang tayong lahat. Kung nasa Russia ka o nasa Amerika ka, ang pag-demonize sa journalists, both by people in power as well as, you know, extreme or even moderate groups, yung suspicion of journalism and what they do is nearly universal. We have a narrative problem sa journalism. We have to tell our own story better.
And how do you do that? Parang may alam ko mahirap na tanong, na rhetorical question, pero ngayon nakaharap tayo sa posibilidad ng isang malaking digmaan.
Mm-hmm.
'Di ba? Tapos hindi naman din, I mean, noong isang taon, syempre na nawala si Trump, 'di ba? Pumalit si Biden. Pero naroon pa rin, no, yung diwa na dala-dala ni Trump, no, sa buong mundo, no, na parang kumbaga hawa-hawa nga tayo lahat, no, nung 2016, di ba? Kaya nga nauso yung post-truth na yan noong 2016. Paano tayo dapat magsalaysay? Paano tayo dapat magkwento ba? No? Ano ba yung dapat nating pagkikwento?
Ako tingin ko, we have to go where the people are. Kung saan sila, kung saan mang platform at tapos ngayon, I think a lot has to do with visual journalism. Mm-hmm. Ang tingin ko may audience pa rin yung accountability reporting at investigative reporting, pero dapat multiple platforms, hindi lang yung mahahabang serye, pero yung talagang journalism na people identify with, that they are interested in, that affects them, na may kinalaman sa buhay nila, hindi parang abstract na ano lang. Mahirap kasi marami tayong kompetensya ngayon eh. Yung mga influencers, di ba? Bayad yung mga karamihan dyan, bayad yan, kompetensya natin sila. So, wala akong magandang sagot sa tanong na yan. Dapat din siguro ayusin yung ating information infrastructure. You know, the social media platforms have to do something about the algorithms that promotes this kind of toxic content. So hindi lang tayo, dapat meron din gawin yung mga malalaking kumpanya na Facebook, TikTok, Twitter,
Mm. Okay, tanong ito mula kay Ginoong Isberto. No? In this era of social media, what can journalists do so they can play a more active role in the country's political life?
Journalists should be on social media. They are on social media, but they should also know that there's a world beyond social media. Minsan sobrang social media tayo. Sometimes I think what's most effective is face-to-face communication. So like, for example, many journalists now are doing face-to-face meetings. It's hard with COVID, but small group, personal interactions, working with universities, with schools, with parishes, with churches, because we are all in the information space. And so we should, I think, journalists should work together with many other groups that are trying to keep the citizenry informed and to propagate truth and facts. Tingin ko, hindi lang social media, Mon. I think there's no substitute for face-to-face communication. Because social media allows for a lot of misunderstanding and disinformation and brings out the worst in people, I think. But if you're face-to-face, it's harder to issue a death threat face-to-face, right? There's more possibility for civility and understanding and mutual respect.
All right. May mga tanong pa, may tanong pa po ba tayo sa ating dito po sa sa ating gallery sa Zoom? May ibig po ba magtanong?
I was wondering if I could also share.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dahil nabanggit rin naman ni Miss Sheila yung father ko in her lecture. And yes, it's true. He was drawn to Marcos. In fact, he campaigned for Marcos twice in the 60s. But his group were already set to campaign for Ninoy before martial law was declared. They were already preparing. He wasn't in the Marcos government in the first time he won. He only entered the second term because he asked for a job because we were dirt poor. My mother said, ganito naman tayo palagi. And he didn't bring in Blas. Blas was there ahead of him. How do I say? Yes, he was a columnist, and I told him I asked him, how did Marcos get you? And because I had a column, and I hit him in my column, and that's what he was looking for: people who could write, who could think, and so he asked me, and if I were to. I wish I had asked him more why he stayed, but you said it because they were drawn to him. He could not think of a better man that he could work for in the 60s. And when martial law came, he said the vision that he gave, he thought was doable. And he never berated me. He never got angry with me because I was in the streets since the 70s, since I was grade 7. And he didn't say anything. He understood, and he wrote about it also in his column that we should not scold our children for fighting for what they believe in, because that's how we were when we were young, their age. We should let them, he said. There was only once when he warned me, or twice. One when I had a very reactionary magazine called The Review, which they didn't give, which I learned from Bon Ilagan. The intelligence said, wag niyong galawin yan. Wala naman na nagbabasa ng magandang magazine dito sa Maynila eh. Kaya pabayaan niyo yan. But we had an interview with Joma, with Bernabe and Julia. Very surreptitiously done. We shook their hands during the trial of the Karagatan, and our questions were written in a long, thin piece of paper, which we rolled and then passed it on to them. And And that's when we knew also that Corpus was an undercover agent, double agent, because only he was prevented by the soldiers there to answer the questions. He was the only one caught. It was, and my father said, you cannot bring out that interview kasi makukulong ka na niyan. Kasi bawal pa. But then a week later, it was all right because who came out with their interview? So I was so angry. And then the second one was I had given birth in 1986 in January, and then EDSA came, and I was looking, and I said, Dad, and he screamed at me, and he said, kanganganak mo lang, iiwanan mo yung anak mo dito. Right? Oh, okay, that's valid. So I'm very happy to hear this from you, Sheila, that you were able to exorcise certain ghosts, certainly which I never did, or never could. I had no opportunity. And I'm amazed also that your father was a lawyer. But Joanne tells me that he also defended her at one. Yeah.
He defended Joe Burgos as well during the We Forum thing, and actually even during my activist days, he just said, be careful. He didn't really stop me. But because he's a lawyer, he likes to argue, so we argue all the time.
My father gave, kasi when before this lecture started, meron si Cristobal ganyan, Cristobal. Well, they don't know him, so I don't mind it. But he helped a lot of writers during martial law, especially those who were incarcerated and they came out, they were judged and all that. Malambot naman puso ng tatay ko, basta writer. Malambot talaga yung puso niya. So, thank you so much for allowing me to share.
Sure, of course. This is after all made possible by the family. So actually, tatawagin ko na kasi parang wala naman yata nang mag-ibig magtanong, no, sa gallery, no. Tatawagin na kita talaga, Selena, no, para sa pagpapasalamat, no, ng pamilya, no, kataunan natin itong ginagawa. So Selena, ito na tayo para sa ating pasasalamat sa ating tagapanayam.
Naman na rin. On behalf of the Cristobal family and Umpil and all those who were lucky to hear your lecture. Maraming salamat, Sheila. At marami nagsasabi sa mga comments, dapat ikalat yung video. Kasi sabi namin, ipupusan, dapat ikalat na mas maraming makanood. Totoo yan. And we will try to do that as wide as possible, so wide audience as possible.
Actually, parang kanina behind the scenes din, no? Parang meron nang nag-broach ng idea na ipasalin sa Filipino ang lektura, no? So yun, nag-heads up na kami na baka manghi kami ng permiso para isalin ito sa Filipino at maaari ipa-subtitle, no, doon sa mga ilalabas na video kasi, no, maganda itong paraan, no, para mas maabot, no, ng marami at mapakinggan, mapanood ng marami ang lekturang ito, no? So maraming salamat, Sheila, of course, at maraming salamat, Selena, sa pamilya Cristobal. Para po ipinid ang ating programa, ibig ko pong tawagin ang tagapangulo ng Umpil at tagapangulo rin ng Kagawaran ng Filipino sa Ateneo de Manila University, mga kaibigan, si Dr. Michael Corosa.
Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat dito sa Pilipinas at diyan sa New York at ibang panig pa ng Amerika. Magandang gabi po. Napakamapalad po nating lahat ngayong araw na ito na narinig ang isang napakagandang panayam mula kay Sheila Coronel. Ang kanyang paggunita ay tunay na inspirasyon para sa ating lahat upang magpatuloy tayong lumingon sa ating nakaraan upang higit nating maunawaan ang ating kasalukuyan at upang higit nating maitakda kung ano man ang nararapat para sa ating hinaharap. Tunay, kung ibig kong balikan itong sinabi ni Joanne Maglipon dito sa chat box at napakaraming napakahalaga na sinabi mo ito, Joan Maglipon. Maraming salamat. Ang sabi niya, I applaud how Sheila's speech talks of darkness and the macabre in politics going back decades and generations, but it does not self-flagellate, does not dump hopelessness in the room, and in fact brings us up to where we fight again. Totoo, ang pagbalik sa gunita ay isang bertud, isang napakahalagang hakbang upang makapagpatuloy tayo sa ating gawain sa kasalukuyan ng pag-akda, ng ng pagsulat at pagwawasto ng kung ano man ang naililihis o naimamali sa maraming pagkakataon. At kaya sana nga ang ating video na ito ngayon na nasa Facebook ng Umpil at ng iba pang mga katuwang natin sa gawain ito ay mapanood pa ng nakararami. At kung sa usapin, Louis John, ng pagsasalin, ako na mismo ang magboboluntaryong magsalin ng sanaysay ni Sheila sa Filipino. At gagawin ko yan sa lalong madaling panahon sapagkat nakikita kong isang pangangailangan din na maipaabot sa marami nating kababayan na makakaintindi ng kanyang panayam na napakahusay at tunay na pinag-isipan. At sabi nga, isang paraan ng pagtataboy ng multo, ng patuloy na nagmultong nagpapakita at lumiligalig sa atin sa kasalukuyan. Muli, sa ngalan po ng lahat ng mga kasapi at ng mga bumubuo sa kalupunan ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas, maraming salamat, Sheila Coronel, sa inspirasyon na ibinigay mo sa amin ngayong umaga. At sana nga sa lahat ng makakapakinig ng ating panayam ngayong araw na ito, patuloy nating isulat at iwasto ang lahat. At maraming salamat, Pamilya Cristobal, sa patuloy na pagtataguyod ng lecture na ito. Hanggang sa mga susunod na lecture pa natin sa hinaharap, sino man ang maging susunod na Pangulo ng bansang ito, patuloy tayong gagalaw bilang mga manunulat, bilang mga tagapagwasto ng mga bagay na dapat mabatid ng sambayanan. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat, Sir Mike. At dyan po nagwawakas ang ika-12 Adrian A. Cristobal Lecture na nagtatampok sa premyado ng Gawad Ramon Magsaysay na si Binibining Sheila Coronel. Maraming salamat po muli at muli sa Pamilya Cristobal sa pangunguna sa proyektong ito mula po sa kalupunan ng Unyon ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas Umpilang amin pong pasasalamat sa pagdalo ng mga naririto sa Zoom at sa ating mga tagapanood, tagapakinig sa Facebook at YouTube. Hanggang sa susunod na taon po, mabuhay kayong lahat. Magandang umaga.
Magandang umaga. Okay,